Hi, welcome back. So let's continue chapter 5. Today, I want to discuss what is a land lease. I want to talk about rent control. I want to talk about rent stabilization. I want to talk about New York City bed bugs, right? I'm quite sure you guys have been waiting for that topic. I want to talk about assignment and sublease, as well as actual eviction and constructive eviction. And then I want to end today's lesson talking about what happens if the landlord passes away or the tenant passes away. So let's begin. So a land lease is a lease of land. So just like an owner can have an apartment and they can lease that apartment out to have somebody to have possession of that apartment, a land lease is similar in that the person that has possession does not own it. So it would be someone that's leasing land. Let's say they want to use it as a parking lot. So a lot of the parking companies, if they don't own the land, especially if the parking company, especially here in New York, is like in a condo building or co-op building. If it's in a co-op or condo building, more than likely that parking services that's at the bottom of the building, more than likely they're not part of the board or part of the building. They're a third-party company. So what they have is what is called a land lease. A land lease is a lease leased out to a third party. They're being compensated by either the co-op board or the condo association to have possession of the space. And then of course they're using the space to rent out spaces, and that's how they're generating income. Now let's talk about rent control. So rent control, I know that this is something that's probably going to be pretty foreign to those of you that's outside of New York City, but rent control is a big deal. So for example, let's say you have an apartment that's a studio, $3,100 a month. Somebody that has rent control could be in the same building and they're paying like $500. So rent control is where the owner chose to get some tax benefits. And by getting these tax benefits, and again, there's no new properties that's being regulated under rent control. So for the most part, I want to say that new properties under rent control stop in like the late 70s, early 80s, because of the fact that it's almost impossible to evict a tenant. And rent control is so strict in that even if you have a tenant that's staying at your property, and again, you're getting a tax break, so that's the reason why you're choosing to have your unit to be regulated, you can only raise the rent for so much. So basically there's what is called the MBR, and it determines how much you can raise. So that's the reason why someone that can have the same apartment for $3,100 is only paying $500. So that's rent control. So that's the reason why in New York City, everyone goes crazy when they hear about rent control, because one of the stipulations is that if you are caring for someone for 2 years, you don't even have to be related to them. Just caring for them for 2 years, now you're able to move into this rent control apartment. So as you can see, it seemed like it was a benefit to owners, but then now that I'm explaining it to you, see why haven't been no new units that being regulated under rent control, because again, it's almost impossible to get possession back of your property. So you still own it, but the problem is you can only raise the rent but so high, and like I said, it's nearly impossible to evict. So what a lot of investors end up doing is paying the tenant a lot of money, like 30, 40, 50,000 to move out of the place, because they know that they can't take them to court, they can't evict them. Like I said, it's nearly impossible. Now, since the late 70s, early 80s, there's no new units that's falling under rent control. So now what we have, which is still present today, is what is called rent stabilization. Now, rent stabilization is something that came out of rent control, but again, a lot of the owners started to complain that, basically they couldn't get their properties back. So rent stabilization was formed. And what rent stabilization is that I as an owner still can't control as far as the rents, how much I want to charge. I can't charge the market. But each year the board meets, the rent stabilization board will meet, and basically the maximum amount when they meet that they can raise it is 4%. So typically it's between 2 to 4%. And then if they don't meet, which a lot of times they won't during this time, right? Because it's COVID-19 is present. So then your rent will not increase. Now, one of the other differences between rent control and rent stabilization is that with rent control, that is per unit. So you could have a building and some of those units in the building can be market rate, and you can tell the difference because when someone opens up their door and it looks like it hasn't been remodeled or updated since 1980s, you know that that's a rent control unit. I can't tell you how many times I've taken a client to look at a $6,000 apartment, Calcutta marble, Viking stove, Viking appliances, and then we get on the elevator, someone is taking their trash out, so you can kind of see their door open up a little bit, and you get to peek into their apartment, and you're like, oh my God, it looks like you were thrown back into the 70s. And that's because the only regulation that the owner has is that everything has to be functional. But when they're remodeling other units in the building, because that unit is under rent control, right, is being regulated, the owners are not forced to remodel those units as well. Everything just has to be functional, which is fair, right? Because remember now, the owners are not receiving market rate compensation. So it's a huge investment to upgrade a unit, a huge cost. So with rent stabilization though, that's going to refer to a whole building. So the whole building will be what is called rent stabilized. So that's the difference. So again, rent control is a per unit. So you can have market rate units as well as rent control units in the same building. But with rent stabilization, the whole building is going to be rent stabilized, meaning that everybody in the building, they only have to worry about increases in their rent when their lease expires, right? After having a periodic lease from between 2 to 4%. That's all they have to worry about. They don't have to worry about their rent increasing any further than that. And again, sometimes their rent is not going to increase at all. So there are a lot of rent stabilized units because again, the benefit for the owner is that all that revenue, let's say they're bringing in $500,000 a month, right, in rents. They have a huge building. They don't want to have to pay taxes on that $500,000 per month, right, which is what, $6 million. They don't want to have to pay taxes on all of that. So in order for them to not have to be taxed on that full $6 million, what they do is they enroll the building into it being regulated, still being regulated under rent stabilization. Another thing that's happened in New York City is if you were to Google, this won't be on your exam, I'm just giving you some like an added bonus. To know about the rent laws, especially if you're gonna do real estate in New York and you're gonna work rentals, you wanna make sure that you are familiar with the laws. The laws just changed for June of 2019. So if you were to look up June 2019, just Google New York City rent laws for June of 2019, you will see that there are some changes there. Like for example, and maybe I'll do a full video. You guys can let me know in the comments if you want me to do a full video on the changes with the rent laws. But some of them is that you can only accept a 1-month deposit. Another is that your application maximum could only be $20. So there was a time where you can apply for an apartment, $300 application fee, non-refundable, all right? So let me know if you want me to do a separate video on that, and I'll do that. The next thing I want to discuss is bed bug. This is something that you probably will not see on your exam, but if you're going to do real estate here in New York City, this is something that you probably want to pay attention to. I will make sure I leave the website for you guys on the screen here. So the website is bedbugsregistry.com, and then you can look on the Metro /New York City. And basically, the reason why this registry exists is because if you are a current tenant that lives in the building by law. The state of New York has a law where only the potential tenant has to be made aware of a bed bug situation. So let me say that again. So if you currently live in a building, under New York state law, the management is not under any obligation to let you know if your building currently has bed bugs. But if you are applying to move into the building, any bed bug infestation that was in the past 12 months, by law, they have to let you know. They have to let you know the floor, the unit number, right? Because we know that bed bugs they can go through the drywalls and everything into the next unit. That's the reason why I'm adding this in the training, because of the fact that there is a map that you can go to, and this registry will give you all the information so that you can look to see which units have bed bugs. The other thing I want to talk about is the difference between a sublease and an assignment. So with a sublease means that, right? Sub meaning it's under someone. So you have the leasee, right? The person that's on the lease, the tenant that's on the original lease, they decide they want to lease out their apartment. So maybe they're gonna tour Europe for 3 months, and they don't want to have to keep paying that $3,000 each month. So what they do, they sublease the place for June, July, and August, but the person that's still responsible, and this is what you need to know for your exam, is the person that's on the lease, the leasee, not the subleasee. Assignment is different. So let's say the leasee goes to Europe, and let's say they find a job and they decide they want to live there full time. So they call up the leasee, right, the subleasee, and say, hey, how would you like to stay here full time? And they agree to it. So then what will happen is that the leasee would then get in touch with the landlord and tell the landlord, hey, I'm not moving back to the States. Could I please assign my apartment over to the person that's staying there now, my subleasee? And then basically that subleasee would then go through the same qualification process that the leasee went through. And then when that person is approved, then the leasee name is going to come off of the lease, and then the new subleasee will now be assigned that apartment. So that's the difference. So with the sublease, the original leasee is still responsible to pay the rent. With the assignment, the new tenant is responsible to pay the rent. So that's the major difference. So now let's talk about the difference between actual eviction and constructive eviction. So with actual eviction is, I'm a landlord, I have a tenant. Remember in the earlier videos, we talked about an estate as sufferance. So I have a tenant there, didn't move out, gave them 30-day notice to move out. They chose not to move out. So instead of me waiting to get an eviction from the court, I decide that I'm gonna call some of my homeboys to go over there to physically remove the tenant out of the premise. So basically I'm taking matters in my own hands. So that's what actual eviction means, is that you're not relying on a court. So you don't have a court order, you don't have anything from the judge, the marshals didn't come by, you are removing them. You're not allowed to change locks, you're not allowed to cut off their utilities or anything like that. That would be actual eviction. And all you're gonna be doing is just giving them more time to be there. Because once you do go to court, the courts are gonna be sympathetic to the tenant by you taking matters in your own hands. All you're gonna do is just either buy that tenant more time or get yourself in trouble, so you don't want to do that. The last one is going to be constructive eviction. So this is where the tenant is allowed to break the lease, okay? They have authorization to break the lease because you as the landlord are not granting your tenants quiet enjoyment, and the apartment is uninhabitable. Some examples of an apartment being uninhabitable would be not having heat or hot water during the winter time, right? So everyone knows that in New York City, it gets cold. So you as the landlord, for whatever reason, you're not supplying heat to the unit. So the tenants decide that they're gonna move out. Now they're allowed to break their lease. That's called constructive eviction. So when you see individuals on TV and they're saying that, you know, they don't have water running, they don't have heat, and that they're not going to pay the rent, in the end, they are going to pay the rent. Now, the landlord will still get in trouble, right? They're still going to receive fines and everything like that. But constructive eviction, which is permission for you to break the lease without having to worry about the landlord coming after you, and you still have the opportunity to get your deposit back. But with constructive eviction, you have to claim, or you are claiming, that the unit is uninhabitable. But if you're still living there, then that means that it's habitable, right? That means that you're still able to live. So in order for you to win, you have to move out. You have to move out. And now that landlord cannot force you to pay them the rest of whatever the lease amount is of your lease. You're allowed to legally break your lease due to constructive eviction. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is what happens when a landlord or tenant passes away. So a lease is very, very strong, extremely strong. So it doesn't matter if somebody's going through bankruptcy, foreclosure. So a lease will hold up in court. That legal document is bulletproof. You have a lease. It doesn't matter if the landlord passes. It doesn't matter if they're getting foreclosed on, bankruptcy, that lease will still stand. So if the owner passes or goes through foreclosure or bankruptcy and you have a lease, you cannot be evicted because that lease is that strong. It will hold up in court. If the tenant passes, what would happen is the tenant, if they left their estate to their kids or to some loved ones, they will now be able to move into the unit. They will have legal authorization because now that tenant that passed, they left their estate to somebody. So now that person who has the lease is now allowed to move into the unit. If the tenant passes and they leave everything to their estate, you as the landlord are not allowed to try to evict the family members for at least 3 months. So let me say it again. You're not allowed to go to the courthouse to even file an eviction until after they've lived in the property for at least 3 months. So with that being known, you may have to say to yourself, well, how much more time do they have on the lease, right? Because you may just say to yourself, you know what, let me just let them live out the lease. And mind you, they still have to pay the rent. So I'm talking about a scenario where, you know, the family moves into the property and they don't pay the rent. So they don't pay the rent, you still have to wait 3 months in order to start the eviction. Please don't forget to like, subscribe so that more people will be able to have access to this content like yourself. I want to make sure that everybody is able to just watch the playlist and go through their whole entire textbook so that you can get out there and start making money in real estate. Thank you. Thanks again for coming to our channel. We look forward to continuing to help you and guide you through your real estate book. We are currently doing a New York real estate sales book, but later on we will follow with California sales book, Florida sales book, as well as New Jersey sales book. So look forward to those videos. One of the other things that we want to also discuss in the channel is investment, because most real estate professionals out there, they never get to learn about investment at their firm. So we want to talk about foreclosures, what type of properties you should buy. So don't forget to like and subscribe and share the video so that you'll be notified when we drop those videos. We're trying to drop at least a minimum of 3 videos per week, and we look forward to seeing you in our next video. Thank you.